World Bank economist, economic advisor to 3 U.S. presidents, president of Harvard University. Larry Summers is considered one of the world's most influential economists. Summers was in Toronto recently, speaking at the University of Toronto's Martin Institute on Prosperity.
Larry Summers seems destined to become an economist. His parents, Robert and Anita, taught economics at the University of Pennsylvania. Not one, but 2 of his uncles, Paul Samuelson and Kenneth Arrow, were Nobel laureates in the field. At the age of 28, he became one of the youngest tenured professors in Harvard's history. In 1991, he was named chief economist for the World Bank. 2 years later, Summers began what would be many years of service under Bill Clinton, including Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, eventually succeeding his longtime political mentor, Robert Rubin, as Secretary of the Treasury. There, he managed through currency crises in Mexico and Russia. Today, there are growing concerns currency devaluations may not be enough to rescue global economies from secular stagnation. That's the fear economic malaise will grip the world in the same way it has stunted Japanese growth for decades. You talk about this theme of inclusive prosperity, such a great concept. It's a concept that would be hard enough to apply inside one country domestically like America, and it's important to do that. You're actually talking about even it being important globally. Is that overly optimistic?
Amanda, I think that we're either going to grow together or we're going to stagnate apart globally. If most countries don't grow, it's going to be very difficult for other countries to grow. You're seeing that already in the difficulties in Europe and Japan and the way in which that's propagating to lower interest rates and more signs of stagnation in North America. And you're seeing it in what markets are telling, the kind of signal that's coming from markets of relatively slow growth to come in North America. So I think that a strategy for growth that isn't global is not likely to be a successful strategy. And that one of the real worries we have is that countries are going to seek to grow by stealing demand from each other rather than by trying to grow collectively. That's an important part of what made the Depression great. And while we're not looking at anything like the Depression of the 1930s in North America, we are looking at very substantial challenges. And I think we've got to be making the case for more expansionary policies in the vast majority of the world.
You've got a view, I think, that secular stagnation is in fact a great threat. There's a bit of a kind of eggheady debate going on among great economists about whether that's the case. And it would be tempting to say we're going to let them wonk it out over there, except secular stagnation has grave implications for all of us. Just describe what kind of scenario you see.
Look, Ben Bernanke and I have had a blog argument in recent times about what he calls a savings glut and what I call secular stagnation. And for some academic purposes, it may be important to distinguish between them. But what they have in common is actually more important than what they disagree on. We all seem to agree that there's too much saving going on and not enough investment. How much is it because there's too much saving and how much is it because there's not enough investment? That's a question which people can debate about. How long is this likely to last? I guess that's a question people can debate about. But when I see interest rates in Europe of 0.6 percentage point for 30 years, it seems like there's going to be a problem of too much savings and too little investment for a very long time. When I see an interest rate in Japan for the next 10 years that's under 0.5 percentage point, that's telling me they've got an issue of a lot of savings relative to investment. When I see forecasts for North America and I see growth as slow as we've seen in North America, that suggests to me that we've got a problem. when I see everybody in China talking about how China has to deleverage, has to be paying back debt, that's saying that there's going to be a lot of saving relative to investment. When I see confidence on the floor in Russia and Brazil and huge amounts of money trying to get out of the country, that doesn't feel like a situation that's going to be repaired overnight. So call it secular stagnation, call it a savings glut, call it a banana. The question is there enough impetus for growth on the current path? And it seems to me the answer to that question is no. And that's got to become a priority for policy going forward.
So what would you say is the right policy in that event?
I think that in most of the world, there's a substantial need for more investment. In many places, the best way for that to come is in public investment. Many Canadians have flown into Kennedy Airport. You look at Kennedy Airport, and it's hard to believe that that's how the gateway to the greatest city and what regards itself as the greatest country in the world should look. Look at an air traffic control system in the United States that's based on vacuum tube technology. That's not the infrastructure that we want. Look at the amount of oil in North America that is being shipped on trains. Train transportation of oil was a 20th century technology and not the last quarter of the 20th century. So I think there's an urgent imperative of getting to adequate levels of public investment. And I think it's also important to reduce barriers to private investment. I am all for environmental protection. I am all for careful review. But those things cannot be allowed to take infinite amounts of time. I think it was a real loss to the global system when we saw the kind of fracturing we've seen in recent times as China has established its own Asian infrastructure bank without the participation of the United States or Canada. Well, that would have been less likely to have happened if the World Bank and the existing banks had been able to do infrastructure in an effective and rapid way. But they had so many reviews, so many procedures, each well-intentioned, that the world has moved beyond those approaches.
You've talked about this, the fact that this infrastructure bank, the Chinese infrastructure bank, really shut America out, or America shut itself out of it, and how important that is. What are the implications for that, for the U.S., and therefore, for those of us who depend on that economy being vibrant?
I think the most immediate, but probably ultimately least important implication is that the United States firms will not be beneficiaries from the procurement and construction opportunities represented by that bank. I think the second implication is that if we're not members, then it won't be our values that are expressed in how projects are carried on. Our values around financial integrity, our values around popular participation, our values around environmental protection. I think the third aspect, though, is that the United States at its best, and we have not always been at our best, but we sometimes have been, and with Canada at our side, has supported a system in which all have an opportunity to flourish and in which anybody's particular advantage of a moment is seen as smaller than the maintenance of the overall system. And when we decline to fund infrastructure that others regard as essential, when we prosecute foreign companies in ways that are not globally seen as legitimate, when we decline to fund international institution reforms for which we have been the driving force, when we find it difficult to win approval and delay for years and years or permanently approval of trade agreements of which we were the original authors. When we do those things, we sacrifice our capacity to be a benign underwriter of a global system. And without a global system, you have a global state of nature in which conflict is more likely, in which the narrow-minded pursuit of commercial objective becomes overriding, and in which the results are less likely to be beneficial for the middle class everywhere.
Larry Summers was a key member of the Clinton administration's working group on financial markets. Along with Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan and Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin, Summers oversaw the deregulation of the U.S. financial system. But he also took a lot of criticism for failing to regulate the derivatives that many blame for bringing the financial system to the brink of disaster in the fall of 2008.
In 1999, then-President Bill Clinton signed into law a bill repealing the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933. It would allow investment banks and deposit banks to combine for the first time since the Great Depression. Then Treasury Secretary Larry Summers hailed the law to better enable American companies to compete in the new economy. Since then, critics have pointed to the repeal of Glass-Steagall as one of the foundations of the subprime mortgage crisis in 2007. Summers does not agree and thinks the issue was about regulations in place but not enforced.
With the benefit of hindsight, it's clear, I think, that if the changes put in place in the 2010 Dodd-Frank legislation had been put in place earlier, that the crisis might not have taken place or certainly would have been mitigated to a significant extent. And so I think all of us who've been anywhere near financial policy would wish that more had been done sooner. That said, and certainly something I think about a great deal. That said, I think many of the accusations that are made that try to look back to the 1990s are quite wrong. The truth is that regulators had very substantial authority in the 2000s and chose not to use even the authority that they had. The truth is that as Canada's experience demonstrates, institutions that are more integrated and less diversified actually prove to be more robust than more specialized institutions like Bear Stearns or Lehman Brothers or Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac or WAMU. So the suggestion that this all goes back to Glass-Steagall reform, I think, is impossible to square with the evidence. But should there have been more capital in institutions? Should institutions have been more closely watched? Yes. I look back at the 1990s, and nobody's ever objective about their own role. And I see the warnings that the Treasury Department in my period gave with respect to Fannie and Freddie, gave with respect to predatory lending. Those were warnings that were not picked up on, and I wish they had been. So did we see all the risks? No, we certainly didn't. But did we see a substantial number of risks and push for policies that the Congress of the other political party was unwilling to adopt? Yes, we did do that. Were some of the problems on the side of progressives who, in their zeal for supporting as many people getting housing as possible, supported policies which proved to be imprudent and to contribute to the housing bubble? Yes, there's responsibility there too, but I don't think any of us deserve primary blame for what happened, and at the same time, I think all of us involved in financial policy can look back and see things that could have happened that would have been constructive if they had.
You had arguably one of the two most important jobs in the function of the American economy, and you came very close to having the other most important job, Fed chair. How do you feel about not doing that job? Is that a role you would have enjoyed?
I have a great life. I have a terrific life. I'm able to speak freely on a whole range of policy questions. I get enormous satisfaction out of working with students at Harvard. I have the opportunity to advise and work with leaders of many different countries and many different companies on a wide range of problems. So I feel greatly privileged to have had the opportunities for public service that I had with President Clinton and with President Obama, but I've got no regrets at all about what I'm doing right now.
And you continue, obviously, to help on the public policy side. This notion of inclusive prosperity, one of the suggestions you make that goes to fairness is about the way people are taxed, the redistribution. And what you say is so sensible, and yet actually changing the system that benefits some very powerful people seems very difficult globally. What's your advice?
I think these things take time, and I've found over time that every once in a while in politics, the transition from inconceivable to inevitable can be quite rapid. And so I think what's important is to continue speaking out, presenting facts, making the case. And I think over time, if one doesn't look at political systems every hour or every day or every month or even every year, a fair amount of progress is made. And I think there's a very different level of awareness of the magnitude of fairness problems than was the case a few years ago. And I expect that over time that will be followed by actions that will lead to a more fair distribution of tax burdens.
Are you optimistic?
I've always been optimistic. I've always been optimistic about the United States because I believe that part of the great strength of the United States, going back to Patrick Henry saying that the spirit of the revolution had been lost in 1791, is that we have this capacity to become alarmed, and then because we've become alarmed, to pull up our socks and do the things that are necessary. That's what we did after Sputnik in the 1960s. That's what we did at the end of the 1980s when people were alarmed about the rise of Japan, and I think that's what we will do again. And it's precisely the capacity to become alarmed and respond that I think gives our system a resilience. And I think because of the role we occupy in the global system, that resilience on our part, in important respects, carries over to the global system. And indeed, the moment I will become alarmed is precisely the moment that complacency sets in and everybody starts to feel relaxed and good about the future without any changes.
All right, we'll leave it there. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.